The war has been a big shock for the EU, which is very interesting in itself because the EU invested a lot in developing its diplomatic corpus. And the fact that it has been a big shock, it also means that the EU was not ready to face up the consequences, and it really has been about firefighting. So a lot has happened, and perhaps because it was such an emergency, a lot of things which were unthinkable before happened very quickly. But there are sort of certain implications, like, for example, repurposing the European the peace facility, the special fund for promoting peace and peace-related activities by the EU. This has been repurposed to purchase military equipment from the EU member states and to give it to Ukraine. So that's an interesting, very ad hoc decision which has been fairly successful. Whereas in other respects, for example, when it comes to assistance, the EU has promised a lot, has certainly been doing, a lot of thinking, but in terms of actually transferring the funds to Ukraine, this has not been so successful. So from the beginning of the war, the EU has offered about 9 billion euros of funding to Ukraine, but so far only about 1 billion has been dispersed. In contrast, for example, to the US, which has already transferred about 8.5 billion. So the EU has been firefighting in many respects, and in some areas it has been more successful than in others. The EU has offered various forms of assistance, ranging from military to rebuilding schools, but the key form of assistance, which is really vital for Ukraine, is macroeconomic assistance. There have been different forms of assistance, and some of them has been like microfinancial assistance in terms of supporting basically the Ukrainian state, supporting the Ukrainian budget to enable Ukraine to pay salaries to teachers and the military. There have been also extra initiatives, like, for example, promising 100 million euros to fund rebuilding schools and building new schools in Ukraine. So those are dedicated sort of ad hoc initiatives. And another, it has been purchasing of military equipment from the member states. So there have been various forms of assistance. However, insofar as Ukraine is concerned, the most urgent one is the support, macroeconomic assistance, to help Ukraine survive the downturn, basically the dramatic impact the war has had on the Ukrainian economy and the budget. The membership perspective is one of those things which happened as a result of the war. After basically denying Ukraine the possibility of becoming an EU member, within 3 months Ukraine became a candidate state. And that was a major concession to Ukraine to immediately grant it what is called candidate status, giving it the prospect of membership, with some conditions attached. But for many EU member states, this is the peak, the summit of solidarity, and not the beginning of it. So it is a geopolitical gesture of showing that Ukraine is in Europe, and yet many member states, despite giving that official status to Ukraine, remain very reluctant to admit Ukraine to the EU in the foreseeable future. Ukraine's starting point is much better than perhaps many other candidate states, because Ukraine concluded and has been implementing the association agreement with the deep and comprehensive free trade area. And that agreement was a game changer because it basically lists the commitments that Ukraine would implement up to 90% of the acquis communautaire. So the starting point and level in Ukraine of familiarity, what membership is about, is much better than it would have been even 5-6 years ago. So Ukraine has been already integrating into the single market. Having said that, it has been successful in some strategic sectors, especially when it comes to agriculture, but when it comes to sectors when there is heavy investment needed, for example, like technical standards or animal products, for example, exporting beef to the EU, the progress has been has been slower. And now Ukraine has a lot of catching up to do in terms of legislation, is done really well, but actually in terms of implementation, there are some heavy reforms and a lot of investment needed, for example, in individual farms. And it's going to be difficult, especially in the sort of war context. It seems that the EU institutions, like the Commission and the European Parliament, are very committed to Ukraine, and they want to see Ukraine as a member. However, amongst the member states, there is no unity and consensus. And as it is, the enlargement process isn't working very effectively. We know the Western Balkans have been stuck in the waiting room for enlargement, some of them for almost 20 years. So the enlargement process, after being a massive success story with the first wave of Eastern enlargement around 2004, has become really dysfunctional. And now Ukraine is joining this unhappy room of the candidate states, and it remains to be seen what kind of political will there is amongst the member states to revise the enlargement strategy to enable not only Ukraine but other countries like Moldova and the Western Balkans to join sooner rather than later. And the member states are not united. And for example, France, as we know, says it will take decades before Ukraine can join.